New York divided, slavery and the Civil War, which opens in 2 weeks at the New York Historical Society. He runs his own company, American History Workshop in Brooklyn and out of Boston. Richard's a trained historian, PhD from Harvard, American Studies. He's the author of The Spiritual Self in Everyday Life, Transformation of Religious Experience in New England, back when he was a traditional historian. John Blatch is one of the most remarkable curators in this business. He's, of course, a trained anthropologist. He's a professor at George Washington University of Anthropology and American Folk Life. He teaches courses on the African diaspora. He's done field work all over West Africa, the Caribbean, and in the southern United States. He's written or edited 10 books. Perhaps most noted was his exhibition, probably for the controversy alone, called Back of the Big House, which was the exhibit about plantation slavery that they tried to put on at the Library of Congress some years back. He has curated exhibitions all over the United States and elsewhere. And last, Gene Howson has been the archaeological director of the African Burial Ground Project. In recent years, she's done field work and research in the Eastern Caribbean and elsewhere around the world. She has taught at a number of universities as adjunct faculty. She currently works for a Boston firm called Amaze Design, which is in charge of the creation of interpretive media for the new center at the African Burial Ground in Lower Manhattan. Now, we've tried to bring together a group of the most distinguished curators, historians, and anthropologists around this question of slavery in the United States. It's clear this panel could have had possibly 4 other people, but I do think we've managed a remarkable gathering of people working on this, and I really look forward to this session. We'll go in that order. John?
My colleague asked me to press the button to change the slide on the PowerPoint, and he said there's only one button you have to press, and sure enough I pressed the other one. Good morning.
Morning. Morning.
I've noticed over the last couple of days that there are 2 ways to get some extra time.
No.
Our first.
One, being a female. And 2, not looking at David Flyer. So I'm going to look the other way there. I've been in the public history profession for going on 27 years. And I got interested in history, believe it or not, when I was 6, 7, 8 years old, when my grandfather, who we affectionately call Papa, would tell us stories about the old African. His first ancestor who came over from Africa was named Thomashan. And he would tell the story about how he was disgruntled and was dissatisfied with his life in Burke County, North Carolina, on this plantation. And he was a troublemaker in terms of how he dealt with other slaves. One day, Wade Still Avery, who was a slave owner, who had been in this country, or his family had been in the country since 1660, who was also a signer of the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence, called him and said, "I understand that you can read and write." And he said yes, he could, and he could read the Quran, and Wade Still provided him a copy of the Quran, and he read it, and he also said that he could speak 7 different languages. So Wade Still was very impressed with his ability, and so finally he allowed him to return to Africa. He kept saying he was dissatisfied. So a local merchant took him down to Charleston, put him on a slave ship, bound for Africa, and told the captain not to let him go ashore by himself. Well, the captain was impressed with his ability, and they had numerous conversations during the passage. And so when they arrived on the west coast of Africa, he allowed Thomas Shaw to go ashore alone. Several days later, he came back with some of his fellow Africans with some gold dust, the equivalent of 4 slaves he had promised Waitstill that he would provide in his stead. He said, tell Avery that he could not sell his people into slavery, and this gold dust would represent those 4 slaves. Well, I was always fascinated by the story, and it was not until I was doing research on my dissertation on the history of slaves in Western North Carolina, going through the Southern Historical Collection papers, the Lenore Irving Avery papers. There were about 40 boxes of materials, that I discovered a pamphlet entitled Reminiscences, Memoirs, and Stories of Colonel Thomas G. Avery, written for the old Morganton Herald. And I read one page in that pamphlet that basically documented the same thing that my grandfather had told us back in the 50s. And needless to say that I was elated. And it got me hooked on history, and I've been hooked ever since. In 1980, I joined the Ohio Historical Society to develop the National African American Museum at Wilberforce, and our first exhibit was From Victory to Freedom. And the museum was to tell a national story, and we were to collect artifacts from all over the country. The interesting thing that we discovered, and I think it has relevance for those of us who will do exhibits on slavery in the future, is that we were asking for 20th century artifacts, but people did not consider those materials to be significant. What they really wanted to give us were family papers, documents, instruments, quilts, pottery, iron pots from the 19th century, and many of those were from their families who had existed in slavery. Our first task then was to, in addition to knowing what individuals held in their possession, we wanted to discover what other institutions possessed. So I decided to travel from Maryland to Florida to see what African American material culture existed and had been collected and preserved. It was not long before I learned of the difficulty of locating and identifying artifacts made by African Americans. Even when they existed, the problem was a lack of documentation. There were thousands of nameless enslaved Africans who labored anonymously on plantations, building homes, carving bas relief, doing, making pottery, clothing, needlework, and various forms of decorative art. Despite outnumbering whites in many crafts, it is the white artisans, not the worker artisan, who are given credit for Southern decorative art. Yet some slaves-related artifacts have been preserved. It was Hampton Institute in the 19th century, emphasizing vocational and industrial education, that encouraged faculty members and others to gather slave-made and slave-used implements, looms, work tools, furniture, and other items produced by blacks. The North Carolina mortal pestles and other rice-producing instruments used by slaves in the production of rice. A trip to the Sea Island revealed how resort development had virtually eliminated settlements in the Sullivan, St. Simons, and Sea Islands. The Charleston Museum preserves some of the oldest forms of fall seed baskets, rice fanners, pottery, signed by Dave the Potter from the Edgefield district of South Carolina. I found other objects that were attributed to Africans or blacks, but were without personal identification. Carving made by a black soldier during the Civil War, an artifact that would become the centerpiece of Before Freedom Came, an exhibit developed by the Museum of the Confederacy. Social forgetting is a phrase that best describes the degree to which Southerners who interpreted plantation homes and historic sites chose to forget the history of 25 to 50% of the Southern population in retelling the history of the Old South. As the preservers of Southern culture, the descendants of the slaveholders chose either to romanticize that history or not to remember those whom their forefathers had enslaved. Rather than deal with the unresolved moral, ethical, painful, and maybe economic issues surrounding slavery, they chose to forget. During a tour of the Haywood Washington House in Charleston, the Southern white interpreters were very gracious as they moved the tour group from one level to another, discussing the furniture, decorative arts, and other architectural elements of interest. As we moved to the lower level, they explained how food was cooked in the adjoining kitchen and brought to the big house by servants. Servants, I wondered to myself, who were these people? But I let the reference pass. As they talked about the servants ironing and sewing and keeping their house generally, I just had to ask, who were these servants that you are referring to? The docent replied, our Negroes, of course. Then I said, do you mean the slaves? I raised the question so that no one in the group would assume that these people were free servants, or worse, to suggest that they could have been white, an interpretation that erases the African American past from the history books. While slavery, of course, is still painful for some, it is, after all, a substantial part of history of our sojourning in America. The docent, obviously disturbed, chose not to reply, but seemed to acknowledge with some appreciation of what I had said. Museums are wonderful places for understanding who we are as a people, what of our history we want to remember, what values we want to share with our children and their children. Most of these decisions are made by curators and historians on curatorial teams as they collect, preserve, and interpret the past. It is interesting to note that throughout the nation, museums were among the last institutions to hire blacks and other minorities outside of the maintenance and security areas, traditional employment reserved for blacks. Even after the push for more diversity within the museum, administrators were inclined to hire blacks as educators, outreach, and sometimes in human resource areas. Yet it is here, within the curatorial ranks, that the real work of building social identity began. We like to think that some odd entities we call museums are keepers of our cultural memory, the people in our community, the places, the events we want to highlight. In reality, it is individuals who interpret our history, tell us about the past through the objects they collect. Thus, it was the white curator who told us about the past and have turned the history of the South and slavery into a white-centric history. African Americans, when present at all in that interpretation, are depersonalized. We're given no indication who they are, how they felt about enslavement, other than that they were happy, but nothing about their aspirations for themselves and their children, and to place a human face on what obviously is a nameless group of people. All of this changed as the African American Museums movement rode the coattails of the Civil Rights Movement and Black Power movement. The slogan, I am somebody, was a direct reaction to the Eurocentric interpretation of American Historical Society, Barry Gaither in Boston, Margaret Burroughs at the Chicago DeSable Museum, among others, said that it was up to African Americans to determine how the past would be remembered and what values would be preserved that would help shape their lives and the lives of their children. Coupled with the dramatic change in the demographics of the urban environment, the movement has had a profound impact on mainstream museums. All of a sudden, museums began a rush to be more inclusive. Foundations like the Lala Wallace Reader's Digest Fund asked me and others to join them in a new initiative that would encourage mainstream museums to reinterpret their collection to address the cultural needs of their new constituents. Art museums rushed to purchase a Jacob Lawrence, a Henry O. Turner, a Robert Duncanson. The Maryland Historical Society invited Fred Wilson, an African American, to mine their collection and develop an exhibit on slavery and African American history in Maryland. Wilson, more than any other person, pointed out the subtle and often insidious ways museums have racialized their collections and interpretation. The exhibit, called Mining the Museum, opened in 1992 during the annual meeting of the American Association of Museums. Using artifacts that traditionally have been used to tell the story of whites in Maryland, Wilson used the same artifacts to tell a different story, and in the process graphically pointed out how museums reinforce a racist attitude and behavior. In 1987, the Museum of the Confederacy, under the leadership of Louis Gore, asked Kim Rice of George Washington University to serve as the curator for an exhibit on slavery. I first read that about the exhibit in a proposal that was submitted to the National Endowment for the Humanities for funding. The very name, Museum of the Confederacy, was a strong indication to me that this proposal would not get funding and would certainly not have my support. But I was pleasantly surprised at seeing such outstanding scholars on the team as John Blatch, Teresa Singleton, Charles Joyner, Deborah White, among others, which indicated to me that the merits of this project were worth examining. In an early effort to expand the interpretive theme, the museum devoted a third of its upper gallery to the people of the Confederacy, which included the often neglected experience of African Americans in the social history of the South. I soon came to agree with Kim Rice that it is possible for a majority institution to take a critical look at the subject and to produce a book and exhibit that displays both objectivity and integrity. After the NEH award announcements were made, I flew to Richmond to convince Lou Gore to allow the northern venue to be the National Afro-American Museum at Wilberforce. Lou agreed and withdrew the offer from the Chicago Historical Society. When the exhibit was installed at Wilberforce, I was overwhelmed with emotion. Kim Rice had borrowed artifacts from dozens of museums around the country and assembled them along with graphic images that brought the lives of slaves to life like no other exhibition had done before. Visitors could clearly begin to understand what it meant to be enslaved. The clothes, cooking utensils, whips, dolls, bills of sale, furniture, and the tools used to make them brought the lives of the enslaved to life. While the exhibit was solidly based in scholarship, it remained a very emotional experience. And after being in the gallery alone by myself and becoming really emotional about what I was seeing, I chose not to go to the gallery alone in the future as long as the exhibit was up. The National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, promising to tell the individual stories of the struggle for freedom within the context of a slave society, opened in Cincinnati in 2004 with strong backing of the corporate giant Procter & Gamble. The story, which finally emerged under the curatorial leadership of Faith Ruffins of the Smithsonian, is packed with information and is politically correct, but within a somewhat sanitized environment and without the benefit of real objects that does not convey the feeling of the lives of the enslaved. The one icon donated to the museum, the Kentucky slave pen, used to house slaves bound for the Southwest on the internal slave trade, was so sanitized and restored to the point of being unrecognizable. when I was at the Louisiana State Museum, I was going through with the curator, and the curator showed me a slave auction block. And the first thing that I did was to reach out across the stanchion and put my hand on the auction block in order to connect with the past and with so many people who had been sold into slavery from that block. That was an icon, and I felt like the slave pen was another icon. When I went out to see it, it was in disrepair, but it was a strong indication of what life must have been like for those who were part of the internal slave trade. And I was standing there talking with the owner of the farm, and I said, "What is that noise I hear in the rafters?" He said, "Well, if you notice, even though it's 2 levels, there are no rafters. The second level has been destroyed. There's nothing between us and the roof, so there's no place for anything to be lodged. But we hear that noise all the time, and the white workers refuse to come into the building alone, and none of them will come out here at night." I felt like this one icon could provide the material link to the past for millions of African Americans, but the icon had been converted by insensitive designers and fabricators into a home worthy of any street in New Haven. The last example I'm going to discuss is the recently opened National Civil War Center at historic Tredegar. The project opened in Richmond in October 2006 and was conceived 8 years earlier by Alex Wise, direct descendant of Governor Alexander Wise of Virginia. Wise's last official act as governor was to sign the death warrant for John Brown. The contemporary Wise believed that by telling a true story, an accurate story of the Civil War, and combining the stories of Confederates, Unions, and African Americans, one could begin to understand the past and to heal from the legacy of slavery, the war itself, and the failure of Reconstruction. It is too early to tell just how successful this venture will be, but it is a bold step using the best scholarship to tell an inclusive story of the hopes of bringing about racial reconciliation in the 20th century.